Your little green wall is a fire hazard, Sergeant. Consider this a community service. The words, dripping with a syrupy, self-satisfied venom, hung in the humid morning air, thicker than the chemical stench rising from the scorched brown skeletons of what had been my pride and joy. I stood on my perfectly manicured lawn, the dew soaking into the cuffs of my jeans, and stared at Karen, the president of our homeowners association. She was a formidable woman in her late 50s, built like a defensive lineman and draped in a pastel pink tracksuit that strained at the seams. In one gloved hand, she held a large, industrial-looking pressure sprayer, its nozzle still glistening with a clear, oily liquid that was even now eating away at the last vestiges of green on my beautiful 8-foot-tall arborvitae hedge. This hedge wasn't just a property line marker, it was a living memorial. My late wife, Sarah, had planted the first saplings with me the day we moved into this house, our forever home. We'd nurtured it for a decade, watching it grow into a dense, vibrant wall of green that gave us privacy and reminded me of her patient, loving hands. Now it was a graveyard of dead sticks, murdered in the night. The chemical smell, acrid and sharp, burned my nostrils and made my eyes water. It was a smell I knew from my time in the Army, the kind of aggressive defoliant you don't buy at the local garden center. "Karen," I said, my voice dangerously calm, the way it always got when the anger went from hot to glacial. "What did you do?" She gave a dismissive little snort, a sound that was half pig, half condescension. "I did what the HOA bylaws empower me to do, Mr. Davison. Section 7, subsection C, elimination of potential fire spread vectors. Your overgrown hedge was a clear violation. I've been warning you about its height for months." She hadn't. She'd sent one vaguely worded letter 3 months ago about landscape maintenance, which I'd responded to by trimming the hedge to its immaculate ruler-straight dimensions. This wasn't maintenance. This was an execution. I took a step forward, my body thrumming with a cold rage I hadn't felt since my last tour. "You came onto my property in the middle of the night and poisoned my hedgerow." Her smile was a tight, smug slit in her fleshy face. "The common area buffer zone extends 5 feet onto your property line, as you'd know if you bothered to read the covenants you signed. I was well within my rights. Now you have 30 days to remove the dead foliage, or the HOA will have it removed at your expense. Have a lovely day." She turned, her ample backside waddling with triumph, and began to march back toward her own pristine, obsessively managed property across the street. The sight of her, so utterly confident in her petty tyranny, so dismissive of the damage she'd wrought, broke something loose inside me. This wasn't about a hedge anymore. This was about a bully who had finally pushed the wrong person. She had mistaken my quiet, disciplined nature for weakness. She had no idea who she was dealing with. She had just declared war on a man who spent 20 years of his life planning, strategizing, and dismantling threats far more dangerous than a power-mad HOA president in a pink tracksuit. She was about to learn a very hard lesson in rules of engagement. If you think that is absolutely insane, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. And while you're at it, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from, or share your own HOA nightmare story. I promise you I read every single one, because stories like these need to be told. Now let me take you back, not just to the beginning of this war, but to the day Sarah and I found this place, this small patch of earth that was supposed to be our sanctuary. We bought the house in Oak Haven Estates for the peace. After 2 decades in the Army, with multiple deployments as a combat engineer, all I wanted was quiet. I wanted a yard I could shape, a home I could secure, and a life I could build with the woman who had waited for me through it all. The neighborhood seemed perfect. Manicured lawns, big oak trees, a sense of order that appealed to my military mind. The HOA at first seemed like a benign entity designed to keep property values high. We signed the thick stack of covenants, conditions, and restrictions without a second thought, eager to get the keys and start our life. Sarah fell in love with the backyard. It was a blank canvas, and she was the artist. Her first project was the hedge. "A living fence, Mark," she'd said, her eyes sparkling. "Something that grows with us." We planted 50 tiny arborvitae, each one a promise. For 10 years they grew, and so did our life within their green embrace. Then 3 years ago, I lost her. A sudden, vicious illness took her in less than 6 months. The quiet I had once craved became a suffocating silence. The order of my life shattered into a million pieces. The only thing that brought me a sliver of peace was the garden she had created, especially that hedge. Tending to it, trimming it, watching it thrive. It was my connection to her. It was the last thing her hands had touched and brought to life. About a year after Sarah passed, Karen Williams was elected HOA president. She had always been a neighborhood busybody, but power transformed her. It was like she'd been waiting her whole life for a clipboard and a title. Her reign began with a flurry of new rules and regulations. The color of mailbox flags, the approved species of seasonal flowers, the maximum height of basketball hoops. She patrolled the streets in her golf cart, a modern-day baroness surveying her fiefdom, jotting down violations in a little black notebook. My first run-in was minor, a fine for my garbage can being visible from the street 2 hours after the designated time. I paid it. The second was for a small crack in my driveway, a trip hazard, for which I was given an ultimatum. Fix it in 1 week or face a daily penalty. I fixed it in 2 days. I saw her pattern. She targeted those who wouldn't fight back, the elderly, single parents, and me, the quiet widower. She saw compliance as submission, and it only made her bolder. The hedge became her obsession. It was too tall, she claimed, though it fell within the 8-foot height limit specified in the bylaws. It was unruly, even though I kept it trimmed with military precision. She wanted it gone. I think its sheer uniform perfection offended her chaotic need for control. She couldn't find a legitimate rule to use against it, so she invented one. And when I politely but firmly stood my ground, citing the very bylaws she claimed to enforce, she decided to take matters into her own hands. That brings us back to this morning. Standing there breathing in the poison she'd used to destroy a piece of my soul, I wasn't just a grieving husband anymore. I was Sergeant First Class Mark Davison, and my new mission was to dismantle Karen's little empire, piece by piece, rule by rule, until nothing was left but the wreckage of her own making. The first step in any operation is reconnaissance. I needed to know my enemy, my terrain, and my assets. And my first asset was the evidence right in front of me, the dead hedge and the poisoned soil it stood in. My military training, particularly in environmental remediation and site assessment, was about to become Karen's worst nightmare. I walked back into my garage, the chemical smell clinging to my clothes, and began to assemble my kit. This was no longer a suburban dispute. It was a contamination site. My first call wasn't to the police or a lawyer. It was to my old unit's unofficial network. I needed information, and I needed it fast. While I waited for a callback, I began my own documentation. I grabbed my high-resolution DSLR camera, the one I use for landscape photography, and started taking pictures. Every angle, wide shots showing the full scope of the destruction against the backdrop of my home. Close-ups of the shriveled brown leaves, so brittle they crumbled to dust at my touch. I photographed the base of the plants where a sickly, oily residue pooled on the soil. I took shots of the property line, clearly marking the surveyor's pin in the ground, showing the hedge was entirely on my side of the line, invalidating Karen's common area buffer zone nonsense. I switched to video, walking the length of the 100-foot hedgerow, narrating what I was seeing, the date, the time, the pungent chemical odor. I made sure to pan across the street to Karen's house, her pristine lawn and smugly glowing porch light, a stark contrast to the chemical warfare she had waged on my property. My phone buzzed. It was a buddy of mine, a master sergeant I'll call Dex, who now worked as a civilian consultant for the EPA. "Mark, what's going on? Your text sounded urgent." I explained the situation, my voice low and even, describing the scene, the smell, the consistency of the residue. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head over the phone. "Sounds like you're dealing with something nasty, man," Dex said, his tone shifting from friendly to professional. "That smell, the rapid kill, it's not your garden variety weed killer. It could be something like imazapyr or a heavy-duty glyphosate concentrate, stuff that requires a license to purchase and apply. It sterilizes the soil. Nothing will grow there for a long time. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Soil sterilization. She hadn't just killed the hedge, she'd salted the earth. What's my move, Dex? Treat it like a hazmat incident, because it is one, he advised. First, secure the area. Keep kids and pets away. Second, you need soil samples, and not just one. You need a grid pattern. Take samples from the base of the dead plants. Take control samples from a healthy part of your yard 50 feet away. And if you can, get a sample from the public easement between the sidewalk and the street. You need a clear chain of custody. Bag each sample. Label it with the exact location, date, and time. Wear gloves. Don't cross-contaminate. This was a language I understood. Chain of custody, grid patterns, control samples. This was my world. Where do I send them? I asked. I'll text you a link to a certified lab, Dex said. Pay for the most comprehensive toxicology screening they have. It's not cheap, but you need an undeniable, legally defensible report. This is an environmental crime, Mark. The EPA doesn't screw around with this stuff. After we hung up, I went to my workbench and pulled out a box of nitrile gloves, a set of new trowels, and a box of heavy-duty, zip-top evidence bags. I drew a diagram of my property in my notebook, overlaying a grid and marking the exact points where I would take each of the 20 samples. This was methodical. This was precise. This was the only way to fight someone like Karen, who operated in a world of lies and twisted rules. You don't argue with them. You present them with a mountain of irrefutable facts so large it buries them. As I worked, carefully digging and bagging the poisoned earth, my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Gobble, a sweet, timid woman in her 80s, peered through her kitchen window. I saw the curtain twitch. She was terrified of Karen, as were many of the older residents. Karen had fined her for having a wind chime that was audibly intrusive. After I finished collecting the samples, I saw her tentatively step out onto her porch. I walked over to her side of the now-dead privacy screen. "Morning, Martha," I said gently. She wrung her hands, her eyes darting toward Karen's house across the street. "Mark, it's just awful," she whispered, her voice trembling. I saw the lights from her golf cart last night, around 2 a.m. I thought I heard a strange hissing sound, but I was too scared to look out. Her words were a confirmation, but I knew getting her to testify would be nearly impossible. Karen had intimidated her into silence. "It's okay, Martha," I said, keeping my voice reassuring. "You don't have to do anything. Just, if you can, maybe write down what you remember, just for yourself. The time, what you saw, what you heard, just so you don't forget." I wasn't pushing her to be a witness yet. I was planting a seed, encouraging her to create her own piece of documentation. People are more likely to stand by something they've written down. She nodded, a flicker of resolve in her frightened eyes, and scurried back inside. I packaged the soil samples into a cooler, printed the lab submission forms Dex had sent me, and filled them out with painstaking detail. I drove to the FedEx depot and sent the package overnight, marking it for priority analysis. The cost was over $2,000, a significant hit, but I considered it an investment in justice. That afternoon, a certified letter arrived. It was from the HOA, officially from Karen's desk. It was the formal notification of the violation: failure to maintain landscaping and harboring dead/hazardous foliage. The letter stated I had 30 days to remove the 100-foot hedgerow at my own expense. If I failed to comply, the HOA would hire a contractor to do the work and place a lien on my property for the cost, which they estimated at a grotesquely inflated $5,000, plus administrative fees. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. She poisons my property, kills a $10,000 hedge, and then bills me for the cleanup. This piece of paper wasn't just a notice. It was a weapon, and it was the second piece of hard evidence in my growing file. I scanned it, saved it to a dedicated folder on my computer I'd labeled Project Overlord, and placed the original in a binder along with my photos and a copy of the lab submission form. The war had moved into a new phase. Karen was using paperwork to escalate, I was about to show her what a real paper trail looked like. My strategy was twofold. First, establish the scientific proof of her crime, and second, dismantle her power base from within the system she worshipped. The lab results were step one. Step two began with a deep dive into the HOA's governing documents. The binder of HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions was a masterpiece of bureaucratic obfuscation, nearly 200 pages of dense legalese designed to be unread. But I was no stranger to impenetrable manuals. I'd spent countless hours deciphering technical specifications for everything from bridge construction to explosive ordnance disposal. This was just another system to be analyzed for weaknesses. I poured a cup of black coffee, sat down at my dining room table, and began to read. Every single word. I used 3 different colored highlighters: yellow for rules Karen had weaponized against me or others, pink for procedural requirements the board was obligated to follow, and blue for any clauses related to property damage, environmental concerns, and the board's fiduciary duties. By sunrise, the pages were a rainbow of ink, and my mind was buzzing with possibilities. Karen had made several critical errors born of arrogance. Her letter to me was a perfect example. The bylaws she'd cited, Section 7C, about fire spread vectors, was real. But another section, 12A, stipulated that before any enforcement action resulting in a cost to the homeowner could be taken, a formal warning must be issued by a majority vote of the full 5-member board, delivered via certified mail, and must include a specific board-approved remedy and a reasonable time frame for compliance. My file contained only one vague letter from 3 months ago, signed only by her, with no mention of a board vote. Her latest letter, the one demanding I pay for removal, was also signed only by her. She was acting unilaterally, using the board's authority as her personal rubber stamp. This was my first point of leverage. My second and far more powerful discovery was in the environmental section. Buried deep in the appendices was a clause, Section 18G, titled Hazardous Material Mitigation. It stated that in the event of a spill, leak, or deliberate introduction of any chemical substance regulated by the state or federal Environmental Protection Agency, the HOA was required to immediately notify the affected homeowner and take all necessary steps to fund and oversee the complete remediation of the affected area, utilizing the HOA's general liability and environmental insurance policies. It was a standard clause probably put there by the developer's lawyers to limit their own liability decades ago and forgotten by everyone since. But for me, it was a tactical nuke. Karen, in her act of petty vandalism, hadn't just committed a crime against me. She had triggered a massive liability for the very organization she controlled. She thought she was billing me $5,000. I was about to hand her a bill that could potentially run into the tens or even hundreds of thousands for soil remediation, removal, and replacement. The lab results were still a few days away, but I didn't need to wait for them to set my trap. I spent the next day drafting a letter. Not an angry letter, but a cold, formal, legal-sounding notification. I addressed it not to Karen, but to the HOA Board of Directors as a whole, listing each member by name. Karen Williams, President; George Maxwell, Vice President; Susan Clark, Treasurer; David Chen, Secretary; and Linda Potts, Member-at-Large. I sent a separate copy via certified mail to each of their homes. The letter was a masterpiece of passive aggression, framed as a concerned homeowner alerting them to a serious issue. Dear members of the board, it began, this letter serves as formal notification pursuant to Section 18G of the Oak Haven Estates Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. On the morning of date, I discovered what appears to be a significant chemical contamination event on my property, resulting in the complete destruction of a mature arborvitae hedgerow and potential soil and groundwater contamination. I detailed the visible evidence, the smell, and the oily residue. I stated that, as a precaution and in accordance with best practices for hazardous material incidents, I had engaged a certified environmental laboratory to conduct a full toxicology screening of the soil. I never mentioned Karen. I never accused anyone. I simply stated the facts of the contamination. Then came the hook. As per Section 18G, I am hereby formally requesting that the board immediately initiate the protocol for a hazardous material event. Please provide me, within 10 business days, with the name of the HOA's insurance carrier, the policy numbers for the general liability and environmental riders, and the name of the adjuster assigned to this claim. I will forward the laboratory analysis directly to them upon receipt. I trust the board will act with the urgency this serious environmental and financial matter requires. I signed it, sincerely, Mark Davison, and included my address and contact information. The letter was designed to do three things. First, it legally and formally put the entire board on notice, making them all individually and collectively aware of the situation. No one could claim ignorance later. Second, it bypassed Karen and forced the other four members to confront the issue themselves. I knew from neighborhood chatter that at least two of them, David Chen and Susan Clark, were decent people who were tired of Karen's antics, but were too intimidated to challenge her. This letter would force their hand. Third, and most importantly, it invoked the magical word, insurance. Nothing gets a board member's attention faster than a potential claim that could jack up their premiums or, worse, be denied, leaving the HOA, and, by extension, every homeowner paying dues, on the hook for the entire cost. The certified mail receipts came back 2 days later, confirming each board member had received my letter. The silence from Karen was deafening. I could almost picture the scene, her reading the letter, her face turning from smug pink to apoplectic purple. She couldn't ignore it, and she couldn't dismiss it as another complaint from a disgruntled resident. I had used her own rulebook against her. I had formally and legally started a process that she could not control. While I waited for the inevitable explosion, I started on phase 2 of my reconnaissance. Human intelligence. I needed allies. I started with a quiet visit to George Maxwell, the VP. He was a retired accountant, a numbers guy. I found him washing his car in his driveway. I approached him not as an adversary, but as a fellow homeowner concerned about a major financial liability. "George," I said, holding a copy of my letter, "I wanted to make sure you saw this. I'm worried about what this could mean for the HOA's finances and our dues." He looked uncomfortable, polishing a fender with a little too much vigor. "I saw it, Mark. Karen is handling it." "Is she?" I asked calmly. Because a potential 6-figure environmental cleanup claim feels like something the entire board should be handling, especially the man who oversees the budget. "You're the treasurer. You know what a claim this size could do to our insurance." "Susan is the treasurer," he corrected, flustered. "I'm the VP. "My mistake, but you still have a fiduciary duty to all of us. All I'm asking is that you make sure the proper procedure is being followed. That's all." I left him with that thought hanging in the air. I had planted another seed. The waiting was the hardest part. Every day I looked at the dead hedge, a brown scar on my property, and felt a fresh stab of anger. But I channeled it. I spent the time organizing my binder, creating spreadsheets, and researching legal precedents for HOA negligence in my state. I was preparing for a long siege. The explosion came 5 days after I sent the letter, an email to all homeowners from the HOA address with the subject line, "Urgent, special meeting regarding baseless legal threats." Karen had taken the bait. The email was a masterwork of manipulative propaganda. Karen didn't name me directly, but she didn't have to. She wrote of a disgruntled resident attempting to bankrupt our community with frivolous and baseless claims in retaliation for standard enforcement of our community's safety regulations. She painted a picture of skyrocketing dues and special assessments that would be necessary to fight this malicious attack. She announced a special community-wide meeting to be held in the clubhouse in 3 days' time to discuss this threat to our financial stability and vote on a legal defense fund. She was trying to frame me as the enemy, to turn the entire neighborhood against me before I could even present my case. It was a classic bully tactic: isolate the target and control the narrative. But she underestimated me, and she underestimated her neighbors. The email had the opposite effect. Instead of uniting everyone behind her, it created a firestorm of questions. People started talking. Why was a standard enforcement issue suddenly a baseless legal threat? What had actually happened? My phone started ringing. The first call was from David Chen, the board secretary. He was a young tech guy and his voice was nervous. Mr. Davison, Mark, it's David Chen. I got your letter. I'm looking at Karen's email now and this is spiraling out of control. Karen railroaded this meeting through. She didn't call for a proper board vote, she just declared it. I'm not surprised, David, I said calmly. Has the board discussed my request for the insurance information? No, that's the thing. She told us to ignore your letter, that it was a scare tactic and that her lawyer was handling it. She said you had no proof and were just angry about the fine for the dead hedge. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. So let me get this straight. She is refusing to follow the procedure outlined in Section 18G, which was triggered by an event she herself caused, and is now asking the homeowners to fund her legal defense for that refusal? When you put it like that, David trailed off. Yes, that's exactly what's happening. David, I said, my tone firm but reassuring. I'm not trying to bankrupt the community. I'm trying to hold one person accountable for her actions and force the HOA to do what the bylaws require. Use its insurance to fix the damage. The only person escalating this into a financial crisis for everyone is Karen. A long pause. What do you need? He finally asked. Copies, I said. I need copies of any and all correspondence related to this, emails between board members, any communication from her lawyer, and I need the minutes from the last 6 months of board meetings. As a homeowner, I'm entitled to them, but a formal request would take weeks. You could get them for me by tomorrow. He agreed. The next call was from a man named Bill, a retired corporate lawyer who lived on the next street over. He was gruff, no nonsense, and universally respected. He'd been watching Karen's power trip for months with growing disgust. Davison, he barked into the phone. Bill Sterling, I got that lunatic's email. I've been waiting for someone to finally stand up to that woman. What's your play? I spent 20 minutes walking him through my strategy, the soil samples, the documented chain of custody, the formal notification to the board, Karen's procedural violations. He was silent for a long time after I finished. Son, he said, and I could hear a smile in his gravelly voice. You've built a beautiful little legal cage, and she's walking right into it. This meeting is your chance to spring the trap. But you can't go in there angry. You need to be calm, factual, and armed with her own rules. He offered to help me prepare, to craft my talking points and anticipate her attacks. An alliance was forming. The quiet, intimidated residents were starting to find their voice. That evening, David Chen dropped off a thick manila envelope on my porch. It contained everything I'd asked for and more. Meeting minutes showing Karen consistently shutting down any dissent, emails where she unilaterally approved fines and expenses, and, most damningly, an email chain between her and the other board members about my letter. In it, she belittled Susan Clark, the treasurer, for even suggesting they contact the insurance company, calling her panicked and disloyal. She told the board she had consulted with the HOA's lawyer, a guy who, Bill later discovered, was just a cut-rate real estate attorney she paid a retainer to for sending threatening letters. There was no formal legal opinion, just Karen's distorted interpretation. The day of the special meeting arrived. As I was getting ready, my phone buzzed with an email notification. The subject line read, Laboratory Analysis Report, your order number. The soil test results were in. I opened the attached PDF, my heart pounding. It was 20 pages of dense scientific data, but I scrolled straight to the summary page. The words leaped off the screen. The samples from my hedgerow showed concentrations of imazapyr at levels 500 times the recommended application rate for commercial forestry use. The control samples from the rest of my yard and the public easement showed zero traces. But there was another chemical listed, a tagant, or chemical marker, unique to a specific formulation of the herbicide. The lab report noted that this particular formulation was a restricted-use pesticide, available for sale only to licensed applicators or governmental agencies for clearing industrial sites and rights-of-way. It was not something you could buy at Home Depot or even a specialty agricultural store. It was illegal to possess without a license, and it was a serious environmental crime to apply it in a residential area. I now had the murder weapon, a specific, traceable, and illegally obtained poison. Karen hadn't just vandalized my property. She had committed a felony. I printed out the summary page of the report, my hands shaking slightly. not with fear, but with a cold, hard certainty. I slipped the report, along with copies of the bylaws and Karen's own emails, into a crisp leather portfolio. Bill had advised me to let Karen run the meeting, to let her dig her own hole, to let her spew her lies and accusations. Don't interrupt, he'd said. Let her build her own funeral pyre. You just stand up at the end and light the match. I put on a freshly pressed shirt and a conservative navy blazer. I wanted to look like the calm, reasonable man in the room, not the disgruntled resident she was painting me as. As I walked out the door and headed toward the clubhouse, I felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about my hedge anymore. It was about Martha Gable, afraid to use her wind chime. It was about David Chen, tired of being bullied. It was about every single person who had been fined, intimidated, or harassed by a woman who got high on her own tiny sliver of power. Tonight, her reign was coming to an end. The clubhouse was packed, a standing room only crowd of anxious and angry homeowners. The air was thick with tension and the smell of stale coffee. Karen sat at a long table at the front of the room, flanked by the other 4 board members. She was in her element, radiating an aura of grim importance. George Maxwell and Linda Potts looked like hostages. Susan Clark, the treasurer, stared intently at a notepad in front of her, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Only David Chen met my gaze as I entered, giving me a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. I found a spot along the back wall, my leather portfolio held loosely at my side. Bill Sterling was already there, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, a silent, imposing sentinel. He caught my eye and tipped his chin slightly. The signal was clear. Stay calm, wait for the opening. Karen banged a gavel on the table, a theatrical gesture that was entirely unnecessary in the small, crowded room. This special meeting of the Oak Haven Estates Homeowners Association will now come to order, she boomed. As you all know from my email, we are here tonight to discuss a grave threat to our community's financial health. She launched into a 15-minute monologue, a masterclass in deflection and fear-mongering. She spoke of her tireless volunteer efforts to uphold the standards that kept their property values high. She lamented the litigious nature of modern society and how one unhappy individual could hold an entire community hostage. She never used my name, but her eyes kept flicking in my direction. This resident, she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, in response to a routine notice regarding a hazardous, dead hedge on their property, has threatened the HOA with a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Multi-million? I had done no such thing. They are making wild, unsubstantiated claims of environmental damage in an attempt to extort money from all of us, she continued, her voice rising with manufactured outrage. To defend ourselves against this baseless attack, the board will need to retain a specialized legal team. This will be expensive. Therefore, I am proposing an emergency vote tonight on a one-time special assessment of $500 per household to create a legal defense fund. The room erupted. $500. People were shouting, jumping to their feet. This was real money, and the injustice of it was palpable. Karen banged her gavel again and again. Order! Order! This is for your own protection. If we don't fight this, our insurance premiums will skyrocket and our dues will double permanently. Bill chose this moment to make his move. He didn't shout. He simply took one step forward and spoke in his clear, authoritative baritone that cut through the noise like a razor. Point of information, Madam President. Karen glared at him. This isn't a town hall, Mr. Sterling. This is a board presentation. According to Robert's Rules of Order, which this HOA adopted in its bylaws, any member is entitled to ask a question for clarification, Bill retorted smoothly. And my question is simple. Before we vote to spend nearly $100,000 of our money, could the board please inform us of the specific documented claim that has been made against the HOA? Not your interpretation of it, but the actual claim itself. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Karen. She was trapped. She couldn't refuse to answer such a reasonable question in front of the entire community. The claim is, it's complicated, she stammered, flustered. It's a legal matter. It's not complicated at all, I said, my voice calm and steady as I stepped forward from the back wall. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea. I walked to the front of the room and stood a respectful 10 feet from the table. My name is Mark Davison, and I am the disgruntled resident in question. I looked directly at the homeowners, not at Karen. I have not threatened a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. I have not attempted to extort anyone. I have done only one thing. I followed the rules. I opened my portfolio. This is a copy of the letter I sent to each board member via certified mail last week. I held it up. In it, I notify the board, as required by Section 18G of our own bylaws, of a chemical contamination event on my property. I requested the HOA's insurance information so that a claim could be filed to cover the cleanup, as is the prescribed procedure. I have, to date, received no response. I then turned my attention to Karen. Madam President, you claim the original issue was a routine notice regarding a hazardous dead hedge. Could you please show the community the board-approved, certified letter that was sent to me as required by Section 12A before any enforcement action was taken? Karen's face was a mask of fury. That's not relevant. It's entirely relevant. Bill's voice boomed from the back. It establishes whether the HOA followed its own procedures. Did the board vote to issue a warning? Did the board vote to take action? Or did you act alone, Madam President? Susan Clark, the treasurer, suddenly found her voice. She pushed her microphone forward. There was no board vote, she said, her voice shaking but clear. Karen told us she was handling a minor landscaping issue. We never voted to issue a formal warning or to take any direct action regarding Mr. Davison's hedge. The crowd gasped. The foundation of Karen's authority was cracking. Furthermore, Susan continued, gaining confidence, I recommended that we forward Mr. Davison's letter to our insurance carrier, as is standard practice. Karen ordered me not to. She said it was a bluff and that she would handle it. Now it was my turn to light the match. Karen didn't want to contact the insurance company because an investigation would reveal the truth, I said, my voice ringing with authority. She talks about a dead hedge as if it were an act of God. It wasn't. It was an act of malice. I pulled the lab report summary from my portfolio. This is the preliminary summary from a certified environmental testing laboratory. The soil around my dead hedge contains a restricted use, soil sterilizing herbicide called imazapyr at 500 times the legal limit. This chemical is illegal to possess without a state-issued license. It is a felony to apply it in a residential neighborhood. I held up the paper. The issue isn't a dead hedge, and the problem isn't a baseless lawsuit. The problem is that a crime was committed. My property was intentionally poisoned with a hazardous chemical. And the person who did it is sitting at that table. I looked directly at Karen. Her face had gone from red to a pasty, sickly white. The smug confidence was gone, replaced by pure animal panic. So, no, I concluded, turning back to the homeowners. I don't think we should vote on a $500 assessment to defend the HOA. I think we should vote to remove a president who has exposed every single one of us to massive legal and financial liability through her criminal actions. And I think we should be asking the board why they allowed this to happen. The room was dead silent for a count of 3, and then it exploded into chaos. But this time, the anger wasn't directionless. It was focused like a laser, right on Karen Williams. The meeting descended into a full-blown insurrection. People were on their feet, shouting for Karen's immediate resignation. Resign! Resign! The chant started in the back with a few of Bill's allies and quickly spread, becoming a deafening roar. Karen sat frozen, her face a grotesque canvas of shock and disbelief. She tried to bang the gavel, but the sound was swallowed by the outrage. George Maxwell and Linda Potts, the 2 board members who had been her loyal sycophants, looked terrified, shrinking in their chairs as if to disappear. David Chen and Susan Clark, however, looked liberated. Susan stood up. I second the motion to call for a vote of no confidence in the immediate removal of the president, she declared into the microphone. Bill Sterling stepped forward again, taking control of the room with the practiced ease of a seasoned litigator. According to the bylaws, a vote to remove a board member requires a petition signed by 25% of the homeowners, followed by a special vote, he announced. But a vote of no confidence can be held right here, right now. It won't legally remove her, but it will send an undeniable message. Hands shot up all over the room. Bill did a quick count. By my estimation, That is a near unanimous vote of no confidence in President Karen Williams, he declared. The minutes will so reflect. Karen finally snapped out of her stupor. This is an illegal meeting. A mob, she shrieked, her voice cracking. You have no authority. I am the president. She stood up so fast her chair screeched backward. This meeting is adjourned. She grabbed her purse and stormed toward the side exit, pushing through the crowd of angry homeowners who parted before her, their faces a mixture of contempt and disgust. She didn't make it to the door. 2 uniformed police officers were standing there, having been discreetly called by Bill a few minutes earlier when it became clear things were escalating. They hadn't entered the room, but their presence at the door was a clear message. Karen stopped dead in her tracks, her escape route blocked. One of the officers, a tall, calm man with sergeant's stripes on his sleeve, stepped forward. Ma'am, we've had a few calls about a disturbance. Karen, seeing a new audience for her victimhood, immediately changed her tune. Oh, thank God, officer, she cried, pointing a trembling finger at me. This man, he's threatening me. He's inciting a riot. He's trying to ruin me. The officer's eyes were impassive. He glanced from her to me, then at the silent, watchful crowd. Sir, he said, addressing me, can you tell me what's going on? Before I could speak, Bill stepped up. Sergeant, my name is Bill Sterling. I'm an attorney and a resident here. There is no riot. The homeowners have just held a vote of no confidence in their HOA president in response to some very serious allegations. I walked forward and handed the officer the summary of the lab report. Officer, my name is Mark Davison. This is a preliminary report from a toxicology lab. It shows my property was contaminated with a restricted use hazardous chemical. That is a felony. The woman who just accused me of inciting a riot is the person I believe committed that felony. The officer took the paper and read it. His expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed slightly. He looked at Karen, who was now sputtering. Lies! It's all lies! He's making it up. Ma'am, the officer said, his voice flat and professional, do you have a license to purchase or apply imazapyr? A what? I don't know what you're talking about. It's a powerful herbicide, ma'am, the officer said. The kind you can't just buy at the store. We're going to have to ask you a few more questions. Perhaps you could step outside with us. I'm not going anywhere. I'm the president, she insisted. You have no right. The officer's patience was clearly wearing thin. Ma'am, you can either step outside and talk with us, or we can have this conversation in a more formal setting. It's your choice. The threat, veiled as it was unmistakable. Defeated, Karen shot me a look of pure, unadulterated hatred, a promise of future vengeance. Then, with as much dignity as she could muster, she allowed the officers to escort her out of the clubhouse. The room was silent for a moment, and then someone started clapping. The applause grew, washing over me in a wave of relief and gratitude. The tyrant was gone. The immediate aftermath was chaotic but productive. With Karen gone, George Maxwell, the VP, was technically in charge. He looked like a deer in the headlights. Bill Sterling, David Chen, Susan Clark, and I quickly huddled with him. George, Bill said firmly, the first thing we need to do is damage control. The very first call you make tomorrow morning is to the HOA's insurance carrier. You report the chemical spill, you give them Mark's information, and you cooperate fully. George nodded numbly. Second, Bill continued, we need to call an emergency board meeting to formally accept Karen's resignation, which I will personally be soliciting from her tomorrow, and to start the process of finding a replacement. And third on, I added, we need to send out a communication to all residents, a truthful one this time, explaining what happened, that the board is handling the contamination issue through the proper channels, and that the proposed special assessment is officially off the table. Over the next few days, our newly formed alliance worked tirelessly. Bill, true to his word, met with Karen and her cut-rate lawyer. Armed with the lab report and witness statements he'd started collecting, including a now brave Mrs. Gable, who was happy to sign a sworn affidavit, he presented her with a simple choice: resign immediately and quietly from the board, or we would hand-deliver our entire file to the district attorney's office. She signed the resignation letter that afternoon. The HOA's insurance company, once notified, acted swiftly. They sent out their own environmental team, who took more soil samples, confirming the lab's findings. The adjuster was horrified. He told me off the record that in 20 years he'd never seen such a clear-cut case of malicious damage by an HOA board member. The claim was approved without question. They would cover the full cost of soil remediation, removal of the dead hedge, and replacement with mature 10-foot-tall trees. The bill would run well over $50,000, a cost that would now be borne by the insurer, not by me or the community. My victory at the meeting was decisive, but the war wasn't over. Karen was gone from the board, but she wasn't gone from the neighborhood. And I knew a woman like that wouldn't go down without a final, desperate fight. The police had questioned her, but without a confession or a witness who saw her actually spraying the chemical, they told me it was a tough case to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. The lab report proved what was used, but not who used it. I had won the battle for the HOA, but I had not yet gotten justice for the crime itself. That would require one more step. I had the what, the where, and the when. I still needed to definitively prove the who. And my old friend Dex had an idea about how to do just that. My conversation with Dex a few days after the meeting was a turning point. The cops are dragging their feet because they don't have the smoking gun, right? He asked. They have motive, they have opportunity, but they can't physically place the specific container of that poison in her hands. Exactly, I said, frustrated. Mrs. Gable saw her near the hedge with a sprayer, but it was dark, and she can't swear it was that exact night or what was in it. Karen's claiming I must have done it myself for the insurance money. Dex was quiet for a moment. I told you that stuff was restricted, right? For a reason. The EPA tracks the sale of those high-concentration herbicides. The tagant, the chemical marker the lab found, that's like a fingerprint for a specific batch from a specific manufacturer. A light went on in my head. You're saying we can trace it? Maybe, Dex said. It's a long shot, but the manufacturer keeps detailed sales records, usually tracking lot numbers to the licensed distributors. If we can get the lot number from the tagant signature, we can trace it to the distributor. From there, we find out who they sold that batch to. It's a needle in a haystack, but if Karen bought it or had someone buy it for her, there might be a paper trail. This was the kind of deep dive investigation I excelled at. It was paperwork warfare, my specialty. The police won't do that kind of legwork for a property damage case, I said. No, Dex agreed, but an EPA investigator might. This isn't just property damage, Mark. It's a violation of the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. FIFRA, it's their turf. The illegal application of a restricted-use pesticide in a residential area, especially near a storm drain that could lead to a waterway, gets their attention. You need to stop thinking about this as a local cop matter and start thinking of it as a federal environmental crime. He gave me the contact information for the Regional Enforcement Office of the EPA. I spent the next 2 days compiling a new file. This wasn't for the HOA or for a civil lawyer. This was an intelligence dossier for a federal investigator. It included my initial photo and video documentation, the certified lab report with the full data workup, a detailed map of my property showing its proximity to storm drains, copies of the HOA bylaws Karen had violated, the minutes from the community meeting, Susan Clark's and Mrs. Gable's sworn affidavits, and a cover letter detailing the timeline of events and my suspicion that this was a deliberate violation of FIFRA. I sent the entire package via registered mail to the attention of the special agent in charge of the Regional EPA Criminal Investigation Division. For 2 weeks, I heard nothing. The silence was unnerving. In the neighborhood, things were changing for the better. Bill Sterling had been unanimously voted in as the new HOA president at a formal meeting. His first act was to schedule a complete independent audit of the HOA's finances going back 5 years, the entire length of Karen's tenure on the board. David Shen and Susan Clark were re-energized, proposing new common-sense rules for transparency, like posting all board meeting minutes and financial statements on a new community website. The atmosphere of fear was lifting. People were planting flowers again. I even saw Mrs. Gable's forbidden wind chime glinting in the sun. Meanwhile, the remediation on my property began. A professional environmental crew in full hazmat suits dug up a 3-foot-wide, 2-foot-deep trench along the entire 100-foot length of my property line, removing tons of contaminated soil. It was a massive, ugly scar, a constant reminder of Karen's vindictiveness. She would drive by slowly every day, a smug little smile on her face. She thought she had gotten away with it. She thought that by resigning the matter was closed. She was wrong. The call came on a Tuesday morning from a number I didn't recognize. "Mr. Mark Davison, this is Special Agent Frank Miller with the EPA's Criminal Investigation Division. I've received your file. It's very thorough." Agent Miller had the tired, cynical voice of a career lawman. "You've done most of my job for me, Mr. Davison. The taggant in your soil report was the key. We cross-referenced it with the manufacturer. It belongs to a batch of Vengeance brand industrial defoliant that was sold 6 months ago to exactly one distributor in this state, a landscape supply company that deals exclusively with government and industrial contracts." My heart started beating faster. "Go on." "That distributor's records show they sold 5 gallons of that specific batch 4 months ago to a small local landscaping company called Prestige Lawn Care. Ring any bells?" I almost dropped the phone. "Prestige Lawn Care is the company the HOA has on retainer," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "They're the ones Karen uses for everything. They mow the common areas, they fertilize, they handle tree removal. And I'm willing to bet," Agent Miller said, "that the owner of Prestige Lawn Care is a good friend of one Karen Williams." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Karen hadn't bought the chemical herself. She'd used the HOA's own vendor, a contractor who had the necessary license, to acquire the poison for her. She had likely told him it was for clearing some brush in a common area, never telling him her true intent. She had used the system itself to procure the weapon. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," Agent Miller said, a hint of satisfaction in his voice, "we pay a visit to the owner of Prestige Lawn Care, and with the information we get from him, we get a search warrant for Ms. Williams' property. People who use chemicals like this rarely use the whole container. My guess is there's a partially used jug of Vengeance sitting in her garage or shed right now. And when we find it, we'll have her." The trap was set. The bait was laid. All we had to do was wait for the warrant to be signed and for Karen's world to come crashing down. I felt a grim satisfaction settle over me. This was justice, methodical and inescapable. She had built her own prison, one violation, one lie, one act of arrogant cruelty at a time. I was just the man who was going to lock the door and throw away the key. The day of the raid was, poetically, a beautiful, sunny morning. The remediation crew had just finished laying down fresh, clean topsoil in the trench along my property line, and a truck carrying 10 massive, 15-foot-tall emerald green arborvitae was idling at the curb, ready to be planted. It was a day of renewal, of rebuilding what had been destroyed. I was outside directing the nursery workers when 2 dark sedans and a local police cruiser pulled quietly up to Karen's house across the street. Agent Miller got out of the lead car, along with another plainclothes agent and the 2 uniformed officers from the clubhouse meeting. They walked up Karen's perfectly manicured flagstone path and knocked on her door. I signaled for the work crew to take a break. I wanted to see this. We all did. The neighbors started to emerge from their houses drawn by the official-looking cars. Mrs. Gable came out onto her porch, a small, triumphant smile on her face. Bill Sterling appeared at my side, a cup of coffee in his hand. "Showtime," he murmured. Karen opened the door, dressed in another garish tracksuit, this one of vibrant turquoise. When she saw Agent Miller and the police, her face went through a rapid series of emotions. Surprise, then indignation, then a flicker of genuine fear. Miller said something to her and handed her a document, the search warrant. Her face crumpled. "This is harassment. You can't do this," she screeched, loud enough for the whole street to hear. "I'm a respected member of this community." Miller ignored her protests and gestured for his team to enter. 2 of them brushed past her into the house, while Miller and a police officer headed straight for the attached garage. Karen stood on her porch, trembling with rage, her mask of suburban civility completely gone. She looked wild, cornered. She saw me standing there watching, and her eyes locked onto mine. The hatred in them was a physical force. You did this," she screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You'll pay for this. I'll sue you for everything you have. Defamation, slander." I just stood there, my expression unreadable. I didn't have to say a word. The wheels of justice, which I had so patiently and deliberately set in motion, were now grinding away on their own. After about 10 minutes, Agent Miller emerged from the garage. He was carrying a large clear evidence bag. Inside it was a 1-gallon plastic jug with a bright red label. Even from across the street, I could read the word on it. Vengeance. Miller held it up for Karen to see. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying in the quiet morning air. "We found this hidden under a tarp in your garage. It matches the batch number of the chemical that was used to poison your neighbor's property. The owner of Prestige Lawn Care has already given a sworn statement that he procured this for you at your specific request for common area clearing. You are under arrest for the illegal use and disposal of a hazardous substance and for felony criminal damage to property." Karen let out a sound that was half scream, half sob. The fight went out of her completely. Her face, which had been contorted with rage, suddenly sagged, looking old and defeated. The two uniformed officers stepped forward. One of them gently took her arm. "Ma'am, you need to come with us." "No," she whispered. "Please." But it was too late for pleading. They turned her around and placed her hands behind her back. The click of the handcuffs snapping shut was the loudest sound on the street. As they led her, shuffling and crying, toward the police cruiser, the entire neighborhood stood in silent witness. The Queen had been deposed. Her reign of petty tyranny, built on a foundation of intimidation and meticulously weaponized rules, had been brought down not by an angry mob, but by her own bylaws, a soil test, and a man who refused to be bullied. As the cruiser pulled away, taking Karen to a world of booking photos and arraignments, a world far from her manicured kingdom, I turned back to the work crew. "All right, let's get these trees in the ground," I said. My voice was steady, but inside I felt a profound sense of release. It wasn't triumph, not exactly. It was the quiet, satisfying feeling of a difficult mission completed. It was the feeling of order restored. The weeks that followed Karen's arrest were like the calm after a long and violent storm. News of the arrest spread like wildfire, first through the neighborhood, then to the local paper. The story was just too good to ignore. HOA president arrested for poisoning veterans' memorial hedge. The article detailed not just the chemical attack, but also the findings from the HOA's financial audit, which Bill Sterling had promptly released. It turned out Karen's corruption ran deeper than just petty abuses of power. The audit revealed years of financial mismanagement. She had been using the HOA's credit card for personal expenses, lavish dinners, online shopping, even fuel for her car, and disguising them as community maintenance or office supplies. She had awarded no-bid contracts to friends, like the owner of Prestige Lawn Care, at inflated prices, likely receiving kickbacks in return. She had selectively waived thousands of dollars in fines for her allies, while ruthlessly pursuing others for the smallest infractions. The district attorney, armed with the EPA's criminal complaint and the forensic audit, added charges of embezzlement and fraud to her rap sheet. Karen Williams, who had obsessed over the color of mailbox flags and the placement of garbage cans, was now facing a slate of serious felonies that could land her in prison for years. Her house went up for sale almost immediately to cover her mounting legal fees. A quiet young family with a golden retriever bought it. The day the moving truck pulled up to her old house was a symbolic moment for the entire community. The reign of terror was officially over. Our HOA, under Bill Sterling's calm and reasonable leadership, underwent a complete transformation. The first thing Bill did was hold a series of town hall meetings, not to dictate, but to listen. He and the new board, which now included a re-energized Susan Clark as treasurer and a few other sensible residents, went through the bylaws page by page with the community. They eliminated the ridiculous, overly restrictive rules about flower colors and holiday decorations. They clarified the vague language that Karen had exploited. They instituted new checks and balances, requiring a full board vote and a public notice for any expenditure over $500. The HOA became what it was always supposed to be, a tool for maintaining the community, not a weapon for controlling it. The atmosphere in Oak Haven Estates changed. Neighbors started talking to each other again. Block parties were organized. The fear was gone, replaced by a renewed sense of community. Mrs. Gable's wind chime tinkled merrily in the breeze, and no one said a word. My own life began to find its new normal. The new arborvitae hedge, taller and fuller than the one I had lost, took root and began to thrive. It wasn't the same, of course. It didn't hold the same specific memories of planting it with Sarah, but it represented something new. It was a symbol of resilience, of rebuilding. I found that tending to this new hedge brought me a different kind of peace. It was a reminder that even after the most toxic events, life could grow back, stronger and healthier than before. I received a formal, written apology from the HOA on behalf of the entire community, along with a check refunding me for the cost of the initial lab tests. I also received a letter from the EPA, commending me for my civic-minded and highly effective pursuit of environmental justice. They informed me that, based on the evidence I provided, Prestige Lawn Care had lost its license and was facing significant fines for its role in the affair. Justice, it turned out, had long and thorough tentacles. 6 months later, I was asked to attend Karen's sentencing hearing. I almost didn't go. I had my victory, and a part of me just wanted to move on. But Bill convinced me it was important to see it through to the end, to close the final chapter for the community. I sat in the back of the courtroom and watched as Karen, looking diminished and frail in a drab pantsuit, stood before the judge. She had taken a plea bargain. In exchange for pleading guilty to felony environmental tampering and 1 count of misdemeanor embezzlement, the other charges were dropped. Her lawyer argued for probation, citing her age, her lack of a prior record, and her deep remorse. She read a tearful, rambling statement about how the stress of being HOA president had clouded her judgment. She never once looked at me. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman, was not impressed. "Ms. Williams," she said, her voice like ice, "you were not a public servant under stress. You were a tyrant who used your position to bully your neighbors. You systematically stole from them, and when one of them had the courage to stand up to you, you didn't just argue with him. You went to his home, under the cover of darkness, and you deliberately poisoned his property with a dangerous chemical. You put your entire community at risk, environmentally and financially. This was not a lapse in judgment. This was an act of calculated malice." The judge sentenced her to 18 months in state prison. Not probation, real time. The gasp from Karen was audible across the courtroom. As she was led away by the bailiffs, her eyes finally met mine. There was no hatred left, no fire. There was only a hollow, empty despair. In that moment, I didn't feel triumph or satisfaction. I just felt a quiet, profound sadness for a life so consumed by a hunger for power that it had ended up destroying itself. I walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, feeling the weight of the past year finally lift from my shoulders. The war was over. I had not only defended my home and my wife's memory, but I had helped liberate an entire community from a petty dictatorship. I had fought back not with anger or aggression, but with discipline, documentation, and a firm belief in the rules. Not the twisted, self-serving rules of a bully, but the true underlying principles of justice and accountability. That evening, I walked the length of my new hedge, the evening light filtering through its deep green branches. It was a beautiful sight. It was a living fence, just as Sarah had wanted, a barrier against the outside world. But I realized it was more than that now. It was a testament to the fact that one person, armed with the truth and the resolve to see it through, can make a difference. They can stand up to a bully. They can rebuild what was torn down. And they can, in their own small corner of the world, restore peace, order, and a little bit of justice for everyone.